No guard is to move, no matter what, Commander Bergman had warned. Not even grief can break tradition today. But as Pope Francis's coffin passed, one man stepped forward with a gesture that melted hearts across the Vatican. So what quiet promise made Corporal Matteo Riedener defy 5 centuries of sacred protocol? Before we answer that, press the subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolled slow and heavy across the grey morning sky, each sombre note hanging in the air a moment too long before surrendering to the next. Corporal Matteo Riedener stood motionless along the black-draped central aisle of St. Peter's Square, his halberd fixed precisely at his side, polished boots planted on ancient stone that had witnessed centuries of both triumph and mourning. Around him stretched a sea of bowed heads, pilgrims with rosaries wound through trembling fingers, diplomats with carefully composed expressions, cardinals whose crimson seemed somehow muted in the day's pale light, all gathered to bid farewell to Pope Francis. For the crowds it was a historic moment. For the Church, the closing of a chapter. But for Matteo, it was something far more personal, something that had been quietly breaking his heart since the announcement came 3 days ago. This wasn't just duty, this was goodbye. The chill in the air seeped through the seams of his ceremonial armour, but Matteo barely registered it. His hands, steady on the halberd's shaft, betrayed none of the emotion churning inside his chest, threatening to breach the carefully maintained walls of his training. Somewhere beyond the square, Rome awakened in muted grief, reluctant to embrace the day. But within these walls, there was only the sound of muffled weeping, whispered prayers, and the choir's haunting notes carried on the morning breeze. Matteo drew a measured breath, the scent of incense catching in his throat, and for just a moment he allowed his mind to slip backward, not to the ceremony unfolding before him, but to a smaller, far more private moment that had changed everything. It was 5 years ago, not long after Matteo had first earned his position in the Swiss Guard. The call had come from home on a Tuesday morning. His older brother, Johann, his childhood protector and best friend, had died in a climbing accident in the Bernese Alps. The news hit like a physical blow, but duty allowed no space for grief. There was a state reception that evening, dignitaries to be guarded, protocols to be observed. So Matteo had done what guards do. He had stood straight, moved precisely, spoken only when necessary. No one watching would have suspected the hollowness spreading through his chest, threatening to consume him from within. That evening, after the formalities ended and the palace had grown quiet, Matteo found himself in the small side chapel adjoining the Apostolic Palace. He hadn't planned to go there. His feet had simply carried him to a place where silence felt sacred rather than suffocating. He sat in the last pew, still in uniform, staring at the altar's flickering candles without truly seeing them. His body felt leaden, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. He never heard the door open, never noticed the soft footfalls approaching from behind. It was only when someone sat in the pew behind him, close enough to sense a presence, far enough to respect the sanctity of grief, that Matteo realized he wasn't alone. He turned slightly, then immediately straightened when he saw Pope Francis sitting there, hands folded in his lap, eyes focused on the same candles Matteo had been watching. "Your Holiness," Matteo began, moving to stand, to bow, to observe all the protocols drummed into him since his first day of training. "Stay," Francis said softly, the word gentle but firm. Then, after a moment of shared silence, "Sometimes the heart needs space to speak to God without interruption." Matteo nodded stiffly, uncertain what was expected of him. He hadn't been prepared for this. There were no protocols for grief caught in the throat of a guard. "I heard about your brother," Francis continued, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age and compassion. Johann, yes? The name, spoken in that quiet chapel, nearly broke him. Matteo managed only a short nod, his jaw clenching to hold back what pressed dangerously behind his eyes. Francis didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. He simply sat, a patient witness to pain too raw for words. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't with grand theological promises or official consolations. It was simpler, more human. "Even the strongest need arms to lean on, my son," he said, leaning forward to place a weathered hand on Matteo's uniformed shoulder. "Today, let your sorrow lean against mine." In that moment, the careful walls Matteo had built crumbled entirely. No guard had ever wept in uniform. It was unthinkable, unforgivable. And yet, there in the shadowed quiet of the chapel, with only candles and an old man as witness, Matteo wept. And Francis simply stayed, his hand steady on Matteo's shoulder, offering not words but presence. That night changed everything. From that moment on, Matteo served not out of duty alone, but out of a fierce, private loyalty to the man who had seen his brokenness and made no demands of it. In the years that followed, there were no dramatic conversations, no special assignments, just small, almost imperceptible moments of recognition, a gentle nod after Mass, a weathered hand briefly touching his shield during a procession, a knowing glance across a crowded reception. To the world, Matteo remained just another Swiss guard, immaculate, disciplined, invisible. But to Francis, and to Matteo himself, there was something more, something unspoken but undeniable. And now, as the great bronze doors of St. Peter's Basilica swung wide and the simple wooden coffin emerged, unadorned, just as Francis had requested, Matteo felt something tighten in his chest. The world had come to say goodbye to a pope. Matteo had come to say goodbye to the man who had knelt beside his pain when no one else had even seen it. The procession moved with solemn grace down the basilica steps. Altar servers with candles and incense led the way, their young faces solemn beneath the weight of the moment. Cardinals followed in their deepest crimson, the colour seeming to catch what little sunlight broke through the clouds. And then came the coffin. Simple cypress wood. No gold ornamentation. No elaborate carvings. Just a wooden box bearing a single crucifix, carried by 8 pallbearers dressed in black. Matteo's heart pounded beneath his breastplate, a steady drumbeat of grief and gratitude entwined. The rules were absolute. A Swiss guard does not move during ceremony, does not react, does not falter. For 500 years, this discipline had been their hallmark, their pride, their sacred trust. And yet, as the coffin drew nearer, Matteo could hear Francis's voice in his memory, clear as the day it was spoken. "Some traditions are built to preserve dignity, Matteo, but never let tradition smother compassion." It had been an offhand comment during a garden walk 3 summers ago. Matteo had been assigned as security detail, while Francis took one of his famous wandering afternoon strolls. They'd passed a young couple with a fussy baby near the grotto, and when Matteo had instinctively moved to redirect them away from the papal path, Francis had stopped him with that gentle observation. Now those words echoed in Matteo's mind as the procession moved with measured steps down the central aisle. Today, tradition demanded stillness. But Matteo knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this day demanded something more. The massive bronze doors of St. Peter's Basilica stood open to the pale morning light, framing the solemn procession now making its way into the square. The centuries-old church seemed to exhale one long, final breath as its faithful son was carried homeward. Matteo tracked the approaching cortege with disciplined peripheral vision. The line of Swiss guards stood like human statues along the processional route, their halberds gleaming even in the muted daylight, their faces impassive masks of ceremonial respect. The coffin moved closer, borne on the shoulders of men chosen for their unwavering hands. Matteo could see the grain of the wood now, the simple crucifix catching occasional glints of light. Behind the coffin, a sombre river of cardinals and bishops flowed in ordered ranks, their vestments stirring in the light breeze. 12 steps away. 8, 5. Matteo's heart hammered against his ribs, but his exterior remained perfectly composed. Years of training had made his body a fortress, impenetrable, unyielding, absolute in its discipline. And yet, inside that fortress, something was shifting with every step that brought Francis's coffin nearer. Not rebellion, not defiance, recognition. The recognition that sometimes honour demands more than obedience. 3 steps away. The world around him seemed to slow, sounds fading into a strange, suspended silence where only his heartbeat remained clear. The mourners' hushed whispers, the distant chanting, the soft shuffle of ceremonial shoes against ancient stone, all receded as the coffin drew level with his position. In that suspended moment, Matteo could almost feel Francis's hand on his shoulder again, could almost hear that gentle voice. "Today, let your sorrow lean against mine." The coffin was directly before him now, and Matteo moved, not dramatically, not with grand flourish or obvious intent. He simply took 1/2 step forward, barely the width of his polished boot, and lifted his gloved hand in a precise, deliberate motion to rest over his heart. A single heartbeat of a gesture, a private salute, not sanctioned by any manual, not permitted by any protocol, but true, in a way that transcended rules. The world noticed. Gasps rippled outward from those standing closest, soft but unmistakable. A cardinal near the front turned his head slightly, brows drawing together. Somewhere to Matteo's left, a camera shutter clicked rapidly, capturing the moment for posterity. But Matteo did not waver, did not rush, did not show a flicker of hesitation. He held the hand over his heart for one deliberate breath, long enough that it could not be mistaken for a movement of adjustment or necessity. Long enough that it became what it truly was, a farewell. Then, with the same measured precision, he lowered his hand and stepped back into position, his face composed, his posture immaculate. The coffin continued its journey, the procession unbroken by his momentary deviation. Perhaps to most watching, it seemed a minor ripple in the vast ceremony unfolding across St. Peter's Square. But ripples, once begun, cannot be undone. And this one was already spreading. The moment passed in mere seconds, but its echoes were immediate and undeniable. Matteo resumed his rigid stance, halberd vertical, gaze forward. But the atmosphere around him had shifted in subtle yet profound ways. He could feel it in the altered quality of silence in the tightened postures of his fellow guards nearby. Across the vast square, the murmurs spread like concentric rings in still water. "Did you see? The guard moved." "Which one? Where?" "There, the tall one near the south column. He put his hand over his heart." Reactions fractured along predictable lines. Some pilgrims pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, eyes welling with fresh tears at the unexpected moment of humanity breaking through the ceremonial facade. Others exchanged concerned glances, their sense of propriety troubled by this departure from tradition. In the section reserved for Vatican officials, similar divisions were playing out in more muted form. Archbishop Mancini's spine stiffened visibly, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line as he leaned toward Cardinal Fiorenza, whispering something that made the older man's eyebrows rise in sharp disapproval. Yet 2 rows behind them, Monsignor Ventresca, who had been Pope Francis's private secretary for over a decade, simply lowered his eyes, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. His weathered hands, folded in his lap, tightened once, then relaxed. Matteo felt rather than saw these reactions. His training held firm, eyes forward, posture perfect, expression neutral. But beneath the ceremonial armour and practised stillness, his heart beat with a strange mixture of peace and apprehension. He had crossed a line, he had broken a vow, and yet somehow he had kept a deeper one. The funeral mass progressed with the weight and solemnity 5 centuries of tradition demanded. Incense rose in fragrant clouds toward the open sky. Latin prayers echoed across the square, ancient words speaking timeless comfort. The choir's voices soared and fell like waves against eternal shores. Through it all, Matteo stood as he had been trained to stand, moved when he was meant to move, a perfect guard once more. But the ripples continued spreading, invisible now but no less real. When the final blessing had been given, and the dignitaries began their measured retreat, when the crowd slowly dispersed into the waiting streets of Rome, when the Swiss Guard formation was finally dismissed, only then did Matteo feel the full weight of what he had done. He followed his unit back to the barracks in practiced formation, his steps matching his companions with mechanical precision. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The slight stiffness in their shoulders, the careful distance they maintained, these told him everything. In the armoury he removed his ceremonial equipment piece by piece, each movement a ritual performed countless times before. The halberd returned to its stand, the white gloves folded precisely. The ornate breastplate lifted from his chest and placed on its designated rack. Only when he had changed into his standard uniform and was walking alone down the narrow stone corridor to his quarters did Commander Bergman appear, seemingly from nowhere. "Corporal Riedener!" The words were clipped, professional. "The prefect's office, immediately." Matteo nodded once, sharply. "Yes, sir." He had expected this, had known, even as his hand pressed against his heart, that there would be consequences. The papal household offices were housed in a quieter section of the apostolic palace, away from the public areas. Matteo had been there only twice before, once for his initial assignment briefing, once for a security coordination meeting. Now, he walked the marble corridor with measured steps, his back straight, his mind calm despite the uncertainty ahead. The prefect's aide, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, showed him into a small antechamber without comment. Inside, 3 men waited. Commander Bergman, Archbishop Dolan, the prefect of the papal household, and, surprisingly, Monsignor Ventresca. The prefect's face was carefully neutral, giving away nothing. Commander Bergman's expression was more transparent, stern disapproval etched into every line, but it was Ventresca's presence that caught Matteo off guard. The elderly priest sat slightly apart from the others, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes tired but kind. "Corporal Riedener," the prefect began without preamble, "you are aware, I presume, that leaving formation during a papal ceremony constitutes a serious breach of protocol?" "Yes, Your Excellency." Matteo's voice betrayed nothing. "And you did so deliberately?" "Yes, Your Excellency." A brief silence followed, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. The Swiss Guard has maintained its position as the world's oldest standing military unit precisely because of its unwavering discipline, Commander Bergman said, his German accent thickening with barely contained frustration. 500 years of perfect service, and today, before the eyes of the world. "Giorgio," Monsignor Ventresca interrupted softly. It was the first time he had spoken, and despite the gentleness of his tone, it silenced the commander immediately. Ventresca turned to Matteo, studying him with eyes that seemed to see far more than a uniformed guard standing at attention. "Why did you do it, Corporal?" he asked simply. The question hung in the air between them, direct and unavoidable. Matteo considered his words carefully. He could offer excuses, could speak of momentary weakness, of emotional strain, could promise it would never happen again. Instead, he chose truth. His Holiness once showed me kindness when I needed it most, he said, his voice steady. Today, I could not repay that kindness with mere stillness. The prefect and commander exchanged glances, but Ventresca's eyes never left Matteo's face. "When was this?" the Monsignor asked. 5 years ago, after my brother died. His Holiness found me in the side chapel near the Pauline chapel. He sat with me. Understanding dawned in Ventresca's tired eyes. I remember that night. He returned to his quarters very late. When I asked where he had been, he said only that he had been remembering what matters. Ventresca turned to the other men. Francis often spoke of the danger of traditions becoming empty vessels, rituals without heart. His voice grew softer. He believed true reverence sometimes requires more than what manuals can dictate. The prefect sighed, rubbing his temple. Be that as it may, we cannot simply overlook a breach of this nature. There are already videos circulating, questions being asked. Then answer them, Ventresca said simply. Not with reprimands, but with truth. That Pope Francis inspired loyalty beyond ceremony. That he touched lives not just through grand gestures before crowds, but through quiet moments of genuine humanity. A heavy silence filled the room. Finally, the prefect straightened in his chair. No formal reprimand will be entered into the record, he said. However, for the next 3 months, Corporal Riedener will be assigned to the Archives Division and Vatican Library Security Detail. It was a compromise, neither punishment nor endorsement, a quiet reassignment away from public view until the moment faded from collective memory. That will be all, Corporal, the prefect concluded. Matteo saluted crisply and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, Monsignor Ventresca called after him softly. Matteo. He turned, surprised by the use of his first name. Ventresca's eyes held a depth of understanding that needed no words. He saw you, the old priest said simply. Always remember that. Matteo nodded once, a slight but unmistakable gesture of gratitude, then stepped back into the corridor, the door closing quietly behind him. He had expected worse, had been prepared for dismissal, for disgrace, for the end of his service. Instead, he had received understanding, and not approval, not quite, but something deeper, something truer. Recognition that there are moments when the heart must speak, even when centuries of tradition command silence. The days that followed passed in a blur of reorganized duty rosters, hushed conversations that fell silent when Matteo entered rooms, and the steady rhythm of his new assignment in the quieter corridors of the Vatican archives. He accepted the changes without complaint or explanation. There was no need to defend what he had done, not to his fellow guards, not to curious Vatican employees, not even to himself. Some actions needed no justification beyond their own truth. Meanwhile, outside the Vatican walls, the world had noticed. Social media buzzed with grainy video clips of the guard who saluted. News agencies ran careful stories about an unplanned moment of humanity during Pope Francis's funeral. Religious commentators debated the tension between tradition and authentic expression of faith. But within the Vatican, the moment was neither celebrated nor condemned. It simply was, a small ripple, gradually absorbed into the vast ocean of history that flowed through these ancient halls. For Matteo, life settled into new rhythms. His duty in the archives was quieter, less visible. Instead of standing watch over crowds of tourists and pilgrims, he guarded climate-controlled rooms of manuscripts and relics, his footsteps echoing through hushed corridors where few visitors ventured. He found an unexpected peace in this reassignment. There was something fitting about watching over history now, after making a small piece of it himself. 2 weeks after the funeral, he returned to his small quarters after evening patrol to find something unexpected waiting for him. A cream-coloured envelope slid beneath his door. No markings, no seal, nothing to indicate its source. Inside was a single card bearing a photograph. Pope Francis sitting on a simple wooden bench in the Vatican gardens, his white cassock bright against the greenery, his face turned slightly away from the camera, as if caught in a moment of private reflection. On the back, written in a shaky hand, were a few lines. He often spoke of you, though never by name. The guard who remembers what matters, he called you. He would have understood your gesture, more than understood. He would have been proud. It was unsigned, but Matteo recognized Monsignor Ventresca's handwriting from security briefings he had signed over the years. He stood by the narrow window of his room for a long time after reading the card, watching evening shadows lengthen across the ancient courtyard below. There would be no medals for what he had done, no public commendation, no recognition in the official records of the Swiss Guard. But some honours were never meant to be displayed, only carried, like faith itself, in the quiet chambers of the heart. Matteo carefully placed the card in the small wooden box where he kept his most precious possessions, the prayer card Pope Francis had given him years ago, a pressed flower from his brother's funeral, the letter informing him of his acceptance to the Swiss Guard. Moments that had shaped him, changed him, defined him. His gesture at the funeral would remain controversial to some, a moment of weakness in a tradition built on strength. To others, it would be remembered as something beautiful, a flash of genuine humanity breaking through centuries of ceremony. But to Matteo, it was simpler than all that. It was a promise kept, a farewell offered, a thank you spoken in the only language that truly mattered, the language of the heart. That night, as he prepared for bed, Matteo noticed something had shifted inside him. The grief of losing Francis remained, but alongside it had grown something unexpected. Peace. Not because he had broken the rules, but because he had remembered what the rules were meant to protect in the first place. The dignity of the human spirit, the courage to stand for what matters, the willingness to step forward when the moment demands it. In the end, perhaps that was Pope Francis's greatest legacy, not just to Matteo, but to all who had truly listened to him throughout his papacy. That sometimes the most profound way to honour tradition is to infuse it with genuine heart. That protocol without compassion becomes empty ritual. That true reverence sometimes requires not standing still, but having the courage to move. Long after the funeral rites had ended and the last echoes of the bells faded into the Roman sky, the whispers about the Swiss Guard's gesture continued to ripple through the Vatican and beyond. In hushed tones over dinner tables and around candlelit vigils, pilgrims spoke of the moment they had seen the tall guard step forward, his hand pressed to his heart, standing not as a symbol of ceremony, but as a man honouring something far greater than tradition. Many wept openly when they recounted it. He moved because he loved him, an elderly nun told a group of visiting students gathered near St. Peter's Square later that night. Because sometimes love matters more than rules. Word of the moment travelled quickly through embassies and diplomatic circles. Journalists speculated cautiously. Some praised the action as a profound tribute, a rare human crack in the usually impenetrable discipline of the Vatican's ceremonies. Others questioned whether the Guard would face consequences behind closed doors, citing the Swiss Guard's centuries-old code of immovable precision. Within the walls of the Vatican itself, reactions remained divided. Some in the Secretariat muttered about discipline slipping, worried that Matteo's action would encourage other indiscretions in the future. Yet others, those who had known Francis personally, saw the gesture for what it was, a living sermon without words, a testament to the very heart of the man whose life they had just celebrated. Even in private chambers, high above the bustling courtyards, Cardinal Salvi, the most senior member of the college, was overheard murmuring to his assistant. He moved because he remembered what we so often forget: loyalty is not silence. It is sacrifice. Still, officially nothing was said. No public reprimand, no commendation, No acknowledgement at all, and in the strange, sacred way the Vatican handled matters too delicate for decree, the moment was absorbed into history, unspoken but unforgettable. And Matteo? He returned to his quarters that evening under the weight of an invisible scrutiny he could feel but never see. Guards nodded at him a fraction slower. Some avoided meeting his eyes altogether. But in those small, fleeting glances he caught, those rare, genuine ones, he saw something else. Respect. Not for breaking the rules, but for honouring something bigger than them. The next morning, as light gradually filled the ancient corridors of the archives, Matteo stood at his post with the same perfect posture, the same disciplined attention he had always maintained. To anyone passing by, he would have appeared unchanged, just another Swiss guard performing his duty. But inside, where no protocol could reach, he carried something new, the understanding that true service sometimes means breaking from formation, if only for a heartbeat, to honour what matters most. As visitors passed through the hushed space, consulting manuscripts or examining relics, few gave him more than a passing glance. He was simply part of the background, as guards were meant to be. But occasionally, someone would look at him a moment longer, would study his face with quiet recognition. "Are you him?" an elderly priest asked one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who saluted at the funeral?" Matteo's face remained impassive. "I serve the Holy See, Father, nothing more." The priest smiled gently. "Of course." He turned to leave, then paused. "But if you were, I would tell you that when you moved, many of us remembered why we believe at all." Such moments became part of his new routine, quiet acknowledgements, unspoken gratitude, small gestures of recognition that required no response. Matteo accepted them all with the same disciplined calm that had defined his service from the beginning. He neither encouraged the attention nor rejected it. Simply let it exist alongside his duty, separate but connected. 6 months passed. The world's attention shifted to new events, new controversies, new moments captured and shared and forgotten. The new Pope, Benedict XVI, began his papacy with careful words about tradition and renewal. The Church moved forward, as it had for 2,000 years. The wheels of ceremony turned once more. The ancient rituals resumed their measured rhythm. Matteo completed his temporary reassignment and returned to regular duty without fanfare. No one mentioned the incident anymore, at least not openly. It had become part of the Vatican's unwritten history, a small footnote known to many but acknowledged by few. On the anniversary of Pope Francis's death, a small private memorial service was held in the side chapel, where Matteo had once wept while a pontiff placed a hand on his shoulder. Only a handful of people attended, those who had been closest to Francis, those who had known the man beneath the papal vestments. Matteo stood guard outside, assigned there by a duty roster that perhaps wasn't entirely coincidental. As the attendees filed out afterward, Monsignor Ventresca, now retired, his frame more stooped, his steps slower, paused beside Matteo. "He would have been pleased," the old priest said quietly, "to see you still standing guard." Matteo remained at attention, eyes forward, posture perfect, but his voice, when he spoke, carried something his training had never taught him. "Not just standing, Monsignor," he replied softly, "remembering." Ventresca smiled, a brief touch of genuine warmth in the cool corridor. "Yes," he said, "that would have pleased him most of all." Later that night, in the privacy of his quarters, Matteo opened the wooden box that held his treasured keepsakes. He removed the prayer card Francis had given him years ago, the one bearing the simple verse, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." He traced the worn edges with his fingertips, remembering the weight of Francis's hand on his shoulder, the quiet strength in that weathered voice. "Today, let your sorrow lean against mine." And he understood, with complete clarity, why he had stepped forward that day when every instinct of his training had commanded stillness. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't defiance, it wasn't even grief, not really. It was gratitude. For a moment of genuine humanity in a world of carefully maintained appearances. For a hand that had reached out when his own soul was drowning. For a man who remembered that beneath every uniform, every title, every ceremonial position beat a human heart. 5 centuries of Swiss Guard tradition demanded perfect stillness in ceremony. But a moment of true compassion had earned something more profound, movement. In breaking with tradition for that single heartbeat, Matteo had not dishonoured his oath. He had fulfilled its deepest purpose, to protect what truly mattered. Not just a title and not just an office, but the human grace that made both worth preserving. Would you have risked breaking centuries of tradition for one small act of love? Do you think some moments demand we set aside the rules to honour something deeper, something more human? And most of all, what does loyalty mean to you? Obedience without flaw, or the courage to step forward when the heart demands it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We truly do read and cherish every one. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss another story about courage, honour, and silent strength. Share this video with someone who believes the quietest gestures often carry the loudest meaning. Our other powerful stories are now appearing on your screen. Watch one next, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another unforgettable journey into loyalty, tradition, and the human spirit.